Running. So when you're ready.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session in the Edgware United Synagogue Adult Education Program entitled The Story of the Boys. Our speaker tonight is Tracy Moses of the 45 Aid Society, and she is accompanied by her father, Harry Spiro, BEM, himself a Holocaust survivor. The 45 Aid Society was set up as a charitable organization in 1963. Its founders were a group of child Holocaust survivors known as the Boys, who were brought to Great Britain after the end of the Second World War, though I hasten to add that of the over 700 children brought to the UK, 204 were girls. I have known about this organisation for many years, since before moving to Edgware, I lived in Wembley, where Sir Ben Helfgott was a member. He was a founder member of the 45 Aid Society and served as its chairman from its inception in 1963 until 2016, when he became its president. He was awarded an MBE in 2000 for services to the community, and in 2018 was honoured with a knighthood in recognition of his contribution to Holocaust remembrance and education. All the members of the Society have dedicated themselves to teach the lesson of the Holocaust so that we can all learn from it. I have deliberately chosen this week for Tracy and her father to give this presentation, since it's the 80th anniversary of the infamous Wannsee Conference on the 20th of January 1942, called to implement the final solution of the Jewish question, whereby most of the Jews of German-occupied Europe would be deported to occupied Poland and murdered. Fortunately, the Nazis did not succeed, and you will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask the survivor questions. As usual, if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your virtual hand when the Q&A starts, and our controller will unmute you. So over to you, Tracy.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you. So I'm Tracy Moses, and sorry, Jeremy, I haven't got the pictures up on the screen. Hello, Johnny?
Yep, working on that now.
Okay, so there'll be a picture coming up soon with me and my dad. So thank you. So yes, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you about my father's experiences during the Holocaust. So Dad was born Chaim Mendel Spiro, but he changed his name to Harry when he came to England at the end of the war. During World War II, he lived through 3 concentration camps, and he was lucky to come out alive. Today, at 92, he unfortunately is no longer able to give presentations himself, and that's why I'm here today, to both speak on his behalf and as a witness for the survivors and the murdered of the Holocaust. So I'm sure you all know that 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust, murdered simply for being Jewish. So I know it's just really hard to sort of take this number in, but imagine the entire populations of Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester and Nottingham being completely wiped out. Well, that's nearly 4.5 million. If you now add in the whole of Northern Ireland, you can see what figures we're talking about. And because the scale is just completely unimaginable, that's why I've always felt it's important to know the individual stories. So I would like to talk to you about my father, Harry, and his life. Dad was born in Poland in a large town called Piotrków-Trybunalski. And before the war, it had a population of 55,000 people, of which 15,000 were Jews. Next photo, please. Sorry. So this is a photo, and the top on the left, that's taken pre-war. So you can see it was a very large, modern, busy town. And the picture at the bottom, that was taken by us on a family visit back in 2007. Dad was born on the 21st of November, 1929, and he lived with his mother, father, and little sister Gita, who was 2 years younger. His father, Laser, was a tailor, And his mother Tama sold milk to help make ends meet, as they were very poor. So she used to collect milk from the farmer in the outskirts of town with the old-fashioned the buckets hanging across her shoulders. So it was very heavy work. Dad was very close to his mum, and he would sometimes help her carry these heavy pails on her milk rounds. Next photo, please. They were so poor that they lived in just one room in an old building. So again, this is a photo that we took back on our family trip. So each green door, that's the entrance to basically the one room that the whole family would eat, sleep, work, and live in. That black toilet, that black door on the right at the bottom, that was the one outside toilet for all the flats. But although they were poor, his grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all lived in the same building. Dad never knew anything different, and so he was very happy. Until 1939, Dad had a normal, happy childhood. He used to play with his friends, go to school, and help his parents at home. Life was pretty good in his small, close-knit Jewish community. Next photo, please. Then, on the 1st of September, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Dad was just 9 years old. It wasn't long before Nazi soldiers were marching on the streets of Piotrków. In the very beginning, Dad says he doesn't remember any dramatic changes. Soldiers still went into shops that were Jewish-owned. Next photo, please. But after only a few weeks, an announcement was made that every Jew in town was ordered to wear a yellow star with the word Jew on it. It didn't matter how old you were, you had to wear this at all times, otherwise you'd be shot. Next photo. Then all Jewish-owned shops had to display a yellow star in their window, so non-Jewish people then became too scared to shop there. Sorry, next photo. There was anti-Jewish legislation, and life became much harder for the community as more and more of their rights were taken away from them and more restrictions were put on them. They could be picked up from the streets and made to perform humiliating tasks while people looked on and laughed. Next photo. Or they were simply threatened and humiliated for so-called entertainment for the Nazis, as shown in this photo. Jews weren't allowed to travel on the trams or go to parks. And then Jews were banned from formal education, from going to school. And so Dad's formal education came to an abrupt halt at the age of 10. It wasn't long before the Nazis forced all Jews to move to ghettos. And in fact, his town, Piotrków, became the first established ghetto in Poland. Next photo, please. Imagine if you were forced to leave your home and go and live in another part of town purely because of your religion. And so Piotrkow's population of 15,000 Jews were suddenly forced to live in one small area in the poor part of town. Well, the room that Dad and his family lived in happened to be in the ghetto, but most families had to leave their homes and possessions at very short notice. The soldiers would turn up at your door, and you had to leave there and then with just what you could carry. You were transported to the ghetto, where you were left to just find somewhere, anywhere to live. Next photo. Dad remembers the Nazis used to patrol the ghetto with their Alsatian dogs. The guards would order the dogs to attack Jews just for fun with the command, "Get the Jew." And then they'd stand there and laugh about it. And next photo. Dad told me about a particular episode when the Nazis rounded up some 20 people. They were doctors, lawyers, community leaders, and they shot them outside the town hall. This was done purely in order to scare the community and ensure that they would obey the Nazis as the Jews now had no leaders to look to. Whilst in the ghetto, there was rationing. There wasn't much food to buy anyway, and as people struggled to work because of the restrictions, there wasn't very much money to spend. And soon the conditions in the ghetto were getting even worse. The Nazis had been rounding up Jews from the surrounding villages and towns and forcing them into the ghetto. So now there were 25,000 Jews living in that small area. There was less and less food and more people. Families were just living on the streets. There was terrible hunger by now, and diseases were spreading. Next photo. Dad remembers that people were now dying of starvation and there were dead bodies every day on the streets. Well, Dad helped his family by taking what little money they had, smuggling himself out of the ghetto, buying food and smuggling it back in. He would sell half the food and keep half for the family to eat. In the beginning, if the Nazis caught anyone smuggling, they would beat them, which did happen to Dad a few times, but it wasn't too long before they started to shoot them. And it was then that his mother asked him to stop, as she was scared for him. After all, he was still just a little boy, 11 years old. And as she always said to him, living is the most important thing. To think of such a world where an 11-year-old boy would even consider risking getting shot just so his family wouldn't die of starvation. Food was running out. They didn't have much money and life was very difficult. Dad was still worried about how to help support his family. He somehow felt responsible for them, even though he was still so young. Next photo. There was a large glass factory just outside of town called Hortensia that employed a lot of people, and at that time they would still pay Jews a small wage. He decided to apply for a job there, but was turned down as when asked how old he was, he told them 11, but you had to be 12 to work there. Dad was determined though, and went back the next day. Luckily, it wasn't the same woman on reception, and this time he gave his age as 12. He was very lucky. He got the job, and again, he was able to help his family so they didn't starve. Next photo, please. So this is a photocopy. We managed to get some records a while back. So it's just a picture of a photocopy, and highlighted there you can see my dad's details, Spyro, Chaim, and Mendel's his middle name. On the right is his address and his birth date, 21st of November, but changed to 1928. So I know it's just a copy of a sheet of paper, but it was actually really emotional when we got that, because it was the first time we'd ever had anything that actually connected Dad to his hometown and his family. Anyway, you're probably wondering what job an 11-year-old would have in a glass factory. And believe it or not, he had to shape molten hot glass into small medicine bottles for Nazi soldiers. Dad still has scars from his legs where liquid hot glass burnt him. Sometimes it was an accident, but mostly it was just a cruel game by the Polish foreman. He liked to see which Jewish children could run the fastest while carrying this hot molten glass. And if he felt they hadn't run fast enough, he would burn them with it. So life carried on. It was hard, but at least the family were together. But then one day, early in the morning in September 1942, a curfew was imposed and no one was allowed to leave home. Next photo, please. But they had no food at home, and so Dad decided to take a risk. He ran out to the building opposite, which was a bakery, and took some bread. If he'd been seen, he would have been shot, but at least his family ate that day. After hours of waiting and not knowing what was going to happen, eventually, in the afternoon, it was announced that anyone with the work permit for the glass factory should go and meet outside the synagogue in town. Well, Dad was the only one of his family with a work permit, and so didn't want to leave his home. Remember, at this time, no one knew about death camps. How could people have possibly even imagined it? His mother argued with him that he had to go, and he kept refusing. Remember, they'd always been especially close. He had his arms wrapped around his mother's waist, and she physically had to unwrap his arms from around her waist and push him out the front door. And she said to him, "Hopefully, let one of us survive." She must have had an idea what would happen to them, but at that time, Dad had no idea what she was talking about. Dad told me how he cried when he left. Remember, he was still only 12, and he couldn't understand how his own mother could do that to him. And little did he know that this would be the last time he would ever see his mother, father, little sister Gita, or any of his family. And it was only years later that he understood what she'd meant, and that she'd done this as she loved him and wanted to give him a chance of survival. Dad told me how he cried all the way to the synagogue, convinced he'd be shot, as by then he was the only person on the street. The SS then moved the factory workers to a smaller ghetto by the outskirts of town, where they were now forced to work as prisoners with no money and only very little food. Next photo, please. Just 3 days after he was taken away from his family, all the remaining Jews in the original ghetto, so those not working in the factory, were rounded up, put on cattle trucks, and sent to Treblinka. Now, Treblinka was an extermination camp. There were no selections for people to be chosen for work. You were gassed on arrival, and the average lifespan there was approximately 45 minutes. His whole family were included in these roundups, and Dad often wonders how his family, especially his mother Tama and his little sister Gita, felt in their final moments. Were they together? Did they suffer a lot? And this is something that will always haunt him. Dad told me how he received a note from his mother that she'd written whilst being transported. When the cattle trucks passed near the factory where Dad was working, I don't know if you can see on the top left-hand corner the little grids that they're not window, but so amazingly, so people would throw their notes out of the small slats, and amazingly, her note found its way to Dad. In it, she wrote again how much she loved him, and again how she hoped that someone in the family would survive. Well, that someone is my dad. He's the only survivor of his entire extended family: parents, sister, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Next photo, please. So back to Piotrkov. One day, when Dad was returning from work at the glass factory with a group of other workers, they were rounded up and taken into the synagogue. There's a picture of the synagogue in town. So he was kept there for 3 days with no food and no sanitation. They were being held there until 500 people had been rounded up, as when the main ghetto had been liquidated, some people hid themselves in the smaller ghetto, which had been set up for factory workers only. So now there were too many people in the ghetto. The Nazis were very organized with their paperwork and records, and they needed all the numbers to match, so needed to get rid of these extra people. They declared that anyone without the correct papers would be given permission to stay officially if they handed themselves in. 300 Jews did this, but of course they weren't allowed to stay. Instead, they were held captive in this synagogue. The Nazis then didn't care so much about who was in the ghetto, just the numbers. So random people, including Dad, were rounded up from the streets until the 500 had been made up. The synagogue was guarded by Ukrainian soldiers, and Dad told me they would take pot shots through the windows just for fun to see if they could shoot anyone, which unfortunately they managed to do. Next photo, please. So the photo that's going to come up, there we go. That was, again, a photo taken on our family trip there. The synagogue is now a library. You can see the files, the books on the side, and you can see the original wall of the synagogue and the bullet holes there. It's normally covered up with a red velvet curtain, but they took it aside for us when we went to visit. So anyway, eventually, the foreman from the glass factory came with a list of workers' names that he needed to be released, as they had quite specialised jobs. And luckily, Dad's name was on the list. Dad always remembers a man being called forward for release. He stepped forward carrying a small child in his arms, maybe about 3 years old. And he was told that he could go, but the child had to stay. And in that split second, the man had to decide whether to stay and face certain death, or go and leave the child behind. Well, he chose to stay, and the next day, everyone in the synagogue was taken to the forest and shot. By the end of 1944, the Russians were advancing, so the Nazis decided to move the prisoners, including Dad, to a camp called Czestochowa. Next photo, please. Here, things started to get even worse for them. Dad was put to work in an ammunition factory. He remembers that a lot of people there had bright yellow skin. Basically, they were working with chemicals to produce the ammunition and should have been wearing protective clothing, but obviously weren't given any. And so over time, their skin had turned yellow. Dad says it was freezing cold and they were given only very, very small food rations. But he wasn't there for long, as the Russians were continuing their advance, and so the Nazis moved the prisoners again. Their train left Czestochowa just a few hours before the Russians arrived. They were then taken to another camp called Buchenwald. Buchenwald was a large holding camp where prisoners were processed for forced labor. In Buchenwald, Dad told me how he was forced to strip, was disinfected, had his head shaved, and was given a striped prison uniform to wear that I'm sure you've seen pictures of. They were taken to the showers, and by this time, they'd heard rumours of the gas chambers, so they were all very nervous, but thankfully it was just a shower this time. His own clothes and possessions were taken away from him, and this included the treasured note that his mother had written to him on her way to Treblinka. And it was here in Buchenwald that even his name was taken from him, and he was given just a number, 116927. Next photo, please. So the next photo is actually a copy of his registration card at Buchenwald, and you can see on the left it's all his details, and they're highlighted on the right. That's his number, and the P is for Polish, and I think that triangle is for Jew. It would have been a yellow triangle. Next photo, please. At this time, Dad personally wasn't given any work to do, but every day there was appel, roll call. So the prisoners were forced to stand for hours on end in the freezing cold. And as you can see, the man in the front, second from the right, he's having difficulties. It was very hard. They were just standing there for hours. The prisoners to the right, either side of him, are helping this man stand up. They only had their thin prison uniforms to wear. They were absolutely freezing, and they just had to stand there for hours. And Dad said they could smell the crematorium from where they were standing, so it really wasn't pleasant at all. Conditions in Buchenwald were bad, and lice spread very quickly among the prisoners. Here there was again very little food for them, but as Dad said, at least he personally had no heavy work to do. Next photo, please. So Dad always used to say, you'll see that the prisoners, they used to sleep in bunks of like 4 high. And Dad always used to say that it was important to get the top bunk, as basically people would be too exhausted or too ill to get out of bed in the night for the toilet. So they would just urinate, vomit, or worse where they were. And as you can see, there are no mattresses, there's just wooden slabs. So basically everything would drip through to those below. After about 2 weeks, Dad was then sent to another camp called Remsdorf. Dad always says that this was the worst camp he was ever in. The work here was very physical, and the food rations, unbelievably, even less than before. When they arrived, they were given a potato. It wasn't clean like the ones we have in supermarkets today, but it was dirty, just dug up from the earth. Dad told us that they peeled the potato and dropped the muddy peelings on the floor. Suddenly, the other inmates jumped to the ground to eat these dirty scraps. He couldn't believe it that people could be that starving, but he also said he wasn't there for long before he was doing the same. Every morning in the washroom, there were dead bodies. People just had no more energy to live. Sometimes they had died and not eaten their bread ration, so Dad would take the bread to eat. I remember him saying how terrible it was that by now they were all so dehumanized. They didn't feel anything at the sight of dead bodies, but just thought how he felt it was his lucky day if he'd managed to get some extra bread. Next photo, please. Some of his work at Remsdorf included rebuilding a Bond chemical factory, which involved carrying heavy electrical cables on their shoulders from one place to another. But one day, 2 guards picked some boys to go mend a fence where the American prisoners of war were being held, obviously in better conditions than the Jews. At the back of the American barracks was a trough where they put all their leftover food, like the rotten food and vegetable peelings, for the pigs to eat. Dad decided to take a chance, so he jumped over the small fence, scooped up some of this rotting food and put it in his pockets. Can you imagine being so desperate to risk your life to eat that? As he made his way back to the group, he saw that one of the Nazis had spotted him. He'd taken his rifle off his shoulder, and that was it. Dad was convinced he'd be shot. But instead, the second Nazi came up and began to beat Dad with the butt of his rifle. He didn't hit him once, but he carried on beating him. Dad was knocked unconscious, and both his front teeth were knocked out. When he came to, he was in a lot of pain. He had blood pouring down his face, but he hurried back to work. And to this day, Dad isn't sure if the second Nazi was vicious to have beaten him so hard, or in his way, was he being kind? At least Dad wasn't shot dead. Dad likes to think that maybe it was kindness. By the end of March 1945, the Allies were advancing and the Nazis decided to evacuate the camp. The prisoners were put on open freight trains, but after only a few miles, the railway was bombed and the Nazis forced the prisoners to walk. Next photo, please. They marched for many days. Dad doesn't remember exactly how long it took, but he thinks it was about 2 or 3 weeks. They would stop off in villages and stay in a barn overnight, but most of these were too small to accommodate the amount of people. And in the night, people would be squashed on top of you, their arms and legs on your chest. And as you were so weak, you could easily suffocate. Dad always said he made sure that this would never happen to him and always tried to sleep by the side of the wall so no one ended on top of him. In the morning, there would be dead bodies on the floor, but they just had to leave them behind and continue with their march. On the march, they were in groups of 200 to 300 people, so it was a very long line. And the only rule was that you had to keep going. So you could sit down on the pavement if you were really tired, if you were really bad, but you had to get up again when the end of the column came by. There were Nazi guards at the back of the line, and if you couldn't get up to walk because you were too ill or too exhausted, they would simply shoot you. And Dad said that on a few occasions he was simply too exhausted. And the thought of, well, at least it will be quick and I won't have to endure this anymore, definitely crossed his mind. But as he said, as the Nazi guards shot the person next to Dad, somehow, thankfully, he always managed to find the strength to get up again. On one occasion on the march, the Allied planes were flying over the group, so they were ordered to lay down and hide in the field. As luck would have it, Dad noticed 2 turnips in the mud, which he managed to dig up. One of the other boys noticed what he'd done and asked for a piece. They argued for a short while and eventually ended up sharing this small bit of food. He survived the war and so did my dad. They became lifelong friends. They were both called Harry. They both married girls called Pauline, and they were business partners for many years. But this terrible journey came to be known as the Death March. And out of 3,000 prisoners who started at Remsdorf, there were less than 300 who survived, all killed through sheer exhaustion and starvation. The Death March eventually ended when they arrived at Theresienstadt. By this time, Dad was seriously ill and doesn't remember actually walking in there, just that he was woken up by a friend called Izzy and was told that they'd been liberated by the Russians on the 8th of May, 1945. Next photo, please. Dad says he knew they were free, but he didn't really know what that meant for him or what he was going to do. He remembers that the Russians were appalled at what they saw and gave the Jewish people freedom to do what they wanted to the captured Nazis. But Dad, who was by now 15, says he doesn't remember anyone wanting revenge. They were just grateful to have survived. After the war, World Jewish Relief Charity, then it was called the Central British Fund, negotiated with the British government to bring 1,000 children from the camps to the UK. At first, the government said no, but eventually agreed, as long as the children were 15 or under, orphans, and survivors of the concentration camp. The charity also had to agree to finance the children so they wouldn't be a financial burden on the state. And although they had permission for 1,000 children, they only managed to find 732 at that time, one of whom was my dad. They were then always referred to as the boys, even though there were some girls among them, and even when they were all well into their 80s. The historian Sir Martin Gilbert wrote a book about the boys, and if anyone's interested, I highly recommend it. It's called simply The Boys, Triumph Over Adversity, and basically it's the history of the Second World War, but interlaced with personal memories and stories of the boys. Next photo, please. Dad came to England on the first airplane transport to Carlisle Airport, and from there they were taken to Windermere. And there you can see Dad highlighted. That's him landing in England for the very first time. And Dad's memories of this time in England was that it was very serene and quiet. The charity sent teachers and volunteers to help teach the boys English and integrate them back into society. Remember, they'd been torn from their families, and from the ages of 10 to 15, they'd seen the worst things and horrors that people can do to each other. Dad always said that the charity showed them that people can be kind and help them to adjust back to normal life. Next photo, please. So the photo coming up, there you go, that's my dad on the right. So the clothes don't fit very well, they're all secondhand, but you can see actually how quickly they put on weight after the war. And as for the clothes, he didn't care. He was lucky to be alive, he was fed, and he was in England and safe. Dad remembers that the idea of getting food at every meal was alien to them. At Windermere, they would sit at long benches for their meals, and a basket of bread rolls would be passed down from one end to the other. But there were never enough for the children at the end of the table, as the boys would take a roll to eat, and then they'd take another 1, 2, 3 and hide them in their pockets for later. You see, it took a while for the idea that they would be fed every day, never mind every meal, to sink in. And also to this day, if Dad ever serves himself any soup or anything from a pan, he'll always scoop like right down into the bottom of the pan. And that's because in the camps, the watery soup that they were served, any vegetables or any bits were always at the bottom of the pan. So that's just a habit that's always stayed with him. I think it was so important that the boys always had each other for support. After all, they were the only ones who really knew what they'd been through, and they were now each other's family. After they'd been at Windermere a while, the charity then started to break the boys up into smaller and smaller groups. Education and training carried on, and eventually Dad ended up living in a bedsit in London with just one other boy. Next photo, please. These are photos of Dad as a young man, and the one on the left, that's actually outside the club that was set up. So Dad had changed his name to Harry by then. It was easier for people to understand, and he'd learned to trade, and he eventually became a tailor like his father. And the charity started a club called the Primrose Club in London, where the boys would still regularly meet up. So that's on the left, that's Dad standing outside, that's number 27 Primrose Hill, that's where the club was. Next photo, please. So this is a very special photo. So the boy on the left, that's Coppel, who was also in menswear, the same as my dad. The second on the left, that's Dad. The one next to him with the white glasses, that's Izzy Kuttner. He's the one who told Dad when they'd first been liberated from Theresienstadt. And the one on the right is Harry Balsam, the one, my dad's partner, business partner and friend. And in fact, your Beit Midrash in Edgware Synagogue is actually, if you look outside, it's named in memory of Harry Balsam and Aaron Meltzer, who was a relation by marriage to Harry. So I really do find it remarkable how the boys went on to live normal and successful lives after all they'd been through. And even a few years after the war, in 1963, they set up the 45 Aid Society, a charity that would, in the early days, offer help of any kind to any of the boys that needed it, whether it was financial or just being there for each other. Then they started holding annual reunions, which continue to this day. And I'm proud to say that we all tend to go there. There's second, third, and even a few fourth generations. So they really are wonderful events. So Dad got an apprenticeship as a tailor and started work, but he felt that although he'd survived the war, he'd lost everything and everyone. He felt empty and he didn't really know what the point of life was. Then, a few years down the line, he met my mother, and after a whirlwind romance, married age 27. Next photo, please. So that's them on their wedding day. They married on the 10th of March, 1957, and had 3 children. I'm the youngest. Dad always used to say that it was one Friday night before I was born. Mum lit the Shabbat candles, and my 2 brothers were playing on the floor. And then it hit him. Finally, he understood what his mother had meant when she pushed him out of the house aged 12. And he said to himself, "Mum, you were right about one of us surviving. It's just he hadn't understood it for a long time." And as he always says now, "Hitler, you didn't succeed. I'm here with a family of my own." Next photo, please. Family is everything to my father. This is a photo taken in 2007 on their 50th wedding anniversary. So it's their 3 children, our spouses, and all 9 grandchildren. Mum and Dad took a conscious decision to not let hate rule them or live in Dad's heart. This must have been incredibly hard for him, but he always chooses love, life, and laughter over bitterness. His greatest joy is the knowledge that his children don't live with hate, and that we've passed this on to our children too, so we can all live happy, normal lives. As he says, if you live with hate, the only person you're hurting is yourself. I grew up in a warm and loving family where we learnt that family and good health are the most important things in life, and to always try to be the best at what you're doing. Next photo, please. In 2007, Mum and Dad took me and my 3 children back to Poland. We visited Dad's hometown and the synagogue I mentioned earlier, where he was held before being released back to work. We then drove to the forest where the other less fortunate ones had been taken and shot into mass graves, including the young man who my dad witnessed making that split decision to stay with his young child instead of being released. So this is a photo of us outside those woods, and the Polish government actually put up these memorial stones. So that was very emotional being there, because there's Dad with a child, grandchildren, and it could so very easily have been him buried in the forest there behind us. We went to visit Treblinka and we said Kaddish for my father's family who were all murdered there. Next photo, please. So I don't know if anyone's been to Treblinka, but I mean, it's just incredible. So, I mean, unbelievable. Every stone there, every jagged memorial stone there, it's not a person, it's not a family, it's not a street where Jews lived. Every stone, and this goes on for as far as the eye can see, is a memorial to a whole town or village where Jews were all taken from. And it was there that I realized it wasn't simply my father's mother, father, and sister who'd been murdered there. It was my grandmother, my grandfather, and my aunt. Dad has done 3 trips with all 3 of his children and 9 grandchildren. He always said it's very important to show us where he was born and where these atrocities took place. So if or when we are confronted by people who say it never happened, we can say, yes, it did, and we saw where it happened. I'm incredibly proud of Dad. After all he went through, but still he managed to make a success of his life, both in business and his personal life. Always so happy, never hating anyone. His greatest pleasure is his family. His wonderful wife, my mother, his 3 children, 9 grandchildren, 2 great-grandsons and 2 great-granddaughters. Next photo, please. So this is a photo which, I mean, that's my dad with his first great-grandsons. It's my brother on the left, his son on the right, and his son on my dad's lap. So this is that 4 generations of, you know, men in the same family is amazing for any family, but especially more so given what Dad went through. Even after the horrors he endured, he still thinks of himself as a lucky man. He survived and has a wonderful family. As he says, it's not where you start in life, it's where you finish. And I have finished very well with a wonderful and loving family. Next photo, please. So this was taken on Dad's 90th birthday a few years ago. And as you can see, the family's grown. I saw the grandchildren, the grandchildren's partners. And in fact, we've even got 2 more great-grandchildren to add to that photo now. And as wonderful as that photo is, next photo, please. I'm actually going to finish with one final photo. So it's an old one and it's not great quality, but this is one of my favorite photos of Dad. This is the father I grew up with, always that little glint in his eye and smiling and just always so happy. So I would just like to finish by thanking you all for listening to me talk about my dad, Harry Spiro. I'd now like to introduce you to the man himself. And if you have any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Quite a remarkable story, and I'm sure people do have some questions to ask you. If you wish to speak, can you put up your virtual hand or just wave at us? You seem to have silenced them all.
Well, your opportunities now, if you want to ask anything. Dad's open to any questions.
Could you ask your father, and I don't know if this is a fair question or not, whether in the last, say, 10 years, he can see any parallels of the growth of anti-Semitism in this country with what he saw in Germany as a young man?
Sorry, any parallels between what's going on now and in Germany?
What has been going on in terms of anti-Semitism?
Right, okay. He's a bit hard of hearing, so I'll just have to tell him. Can you see any familiarities in what you went through and sort of modern day anti-Semitism, what's going on now?
Well, basically, when I was liberated and I had people, politicians talking worldwide, and they always finished up, we've got to do this, never allowing to happen again, never. Unfortunately, it's beginning to happen the same thing in different format. And unfortunately, we haven't learned a lot.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, Heather and Fred Vile.
Oh,
Could you unmute, please? You're not unmuted. No. Right, could you start again, please?
That's better.
there
Right.
we go.
Right. Yeah. What does your father think about the current situation of Poland trying to distance itself from the atrocities that they themselves carried out during the war, and trying to say that the only people responsible were the Nazis?
How do you feel about, at the moment, Poland? He's saying Poland is trying to distance himself from what they were involved in during the war and blaming it all on the Nazis. How do you feel about that?
Well, not very good, because it did happen. I don't know whether any of you audience or people saw 1950, early 52.
Keep it quick.
That's a question.
They made the film The Shoah, and you could see this film. Hopefully you can still buy it, and you see that it happened right away so early in after the war, 1950s, that we haven't learned a lot, and it will take a long, long time, a long journey to learn more.
Okay, thank you.
Could you please unmute Maya?
Hi, I can't see you. Hi.
Hi, it's Steve. I'm
Hi.
Tracy's son and Harry's grandson. So proud of you both. Well done.
Thank you.
But my question is, Grandpa, what was it when you were in the camps, in the middle of it? You knew your family had been killed. What kept your motivation to keep on, surviving every day? What was motivating you to keep going?
Very much a lot what my mother said to me. Life is very important, and to live is more important than anything else. And to me, it was basically not that it was bad, wrong, what the Germans done, killing, doing all sorts of things. To me, it's another day, I'm alive, how can I get on the next day? I never started asking myself questions. What they're doing, it is wrong. What can I do to make it right? Or what can I do? Basically, nothing, just carry on. And my thinking, my talking was basically, it's another day, I'm alive. How do I get on for another day?
Can I just interrupt? Thank you, Daddy. But there's also a message from his granddaughter Jenna, and Jenna is typing. She can't. Her camera's not working, so she can't talk to you. She wants to know. She writes, "I would like to know, in a world full of hate, how you managed to live life so positively after everything you went through, and how you became the best grandpa they could ever ask for."
Oh, thank you very much that I'm the best grandpa. Well, look, in life, if you want to bring up a family, live a normal life, you can't tell your children or grandchildren, well, what I went through, you got to hate the Germans or the Poles, you got to hate them. Well, nothing can help you or help anybody if you hate somebody. You can only make it wrong, bad for you. You can't live a nice life and bring up children without hate. If you hate people, then what do you achieve? Nothing.
And I also think, I'd like to pass that as well, I also think it was marrying the right woman who she helped you a lot, and you two were a team together, and you got on with your new life together, didn't you?
Of course. It is very important to have the right partner.
Okay, so there's some other questions.
Jane Mars, if you can unmute.
Firstly, what an inspiring evening. Harry, if I could come and give you a hug, I would. So your daughter will have to do it on our behalf. It's been
with pleasure.
An absolute inspiration to hear you. I'm interested to know, at what age did you tell your children about what you had gone through? And what age do you think we should be educating our young children about the Holocaust?
Well, what I'm saying to educate our children about the Holocaust is not just what happened now. What I'm saying to my children, grandchildren, is by hating, you don't achieve nothing. God didn't tell, take a machine gun and kill so many people. It's people themselves. They are doing it on behalf of God, or on behalf of their leaders. And that is wrong. You don't achieve nothing about it.
And can I just add to that as well about at what age they told us? We were never I never remember a point in life where we were sat down and told what happened. It was just always there, but in an age appropriate way. And I always knew that we never had the family. We only ever had one set of grandparents, which, you know, it's what you're used to. When I realized other people had two sets of grandparents, that was weird for me. But we always had the boys, and they were like our extended family. So we had all these aunts and uncles and cousins, and even today there's still a connection between us and, you know, all the second gen. So yeah, there was never really one point in time where they sat down and told us children. It was just always there, age appropriate.
Right. Lana Sparrow.
That's my brother and sister-in-law. You're muted still, Gar. There you go.
Okay. Hi. So yes. So thank you for the introduction. It's not really it's not a question. I just wanted to say, you know, I've clearly heard Dad tell his story on many occasions, and I thought you did a great job at telling the same story, but from our perspective as a second generation. And, you know, I think it's really important as fewer and fewer people can tell their story on a first-hand basis, that what you've got and your presentation was fantastic.
Thank you, Gary.
Clearly a bit the family bias, but I'm sure everyone agrees with me.
Thank you.
You know, I want to tell you, many times came to my mind really, when I was liberated, and the boy who was on the picture there, Izzy, I went out with him outside Theresienstadt. And many months, years later, I kept on asking myself, normally you see people wanting revenge, especially what the Germans done to me, to us Jews. You do want revenge. And I can't understand the hour I was liberated and the Russian soldiers said you can go out from here and you will see Germans marching because we captured them. I never thought of taking an object, killing one or hit him for what he done. I mean, it was so fresh. I don't mean 10 years down the line. I'm talking a few hours. And I never had this in me for avenging what they've done. Why? I don't know. Is it because the way my parents brought me up and taught me? I don't know, but it works for me better than by hating people and by us looking for revenge. Revenge, we haven't learned a lot.
Thank you.
Could your father say something about the people he knew at Windermere, the boys and the girls, what the Holocaust did to their faith, to their religion? Did they keep more? Did they keep less? How did it vary?
He wants to know, with the boys at Windermere, how did the Holocaust affect their faith? Were turned against them, were more religious?
Well, some became very religious and they became quite up in their belief, in their thinking. Some, like myself, I took it for granted. Life is different. You get on with life, get on with family. So we got a lot of different people, boys and girls. Some went for religion, some didn't. No, didn't affect, to my mind, it didn't affect it dramatically either way.
And do you know, did most of them, because of their experiences, keep within the Jewish faith, or did they try to integrate into general society and forget that they were Jewish?
Do you hear that? Because most of them, in your opinion, did they stick to Judaism or did they integrate and lose their Judaism?
Many years ago, I used to go around to school and give talks.
No, but the boys. Okay.
And I've been asked by schoolgirls, children, how did it affect you, your religion? And my answer was then, many years ago, when I could still talk and walk, and I said, religion has got nothing to do with God. Religion is something that you believe or you don't believe. It is very good religion. God doesn't tell the Jews or the Muslim or the Christians, pick up a gun and kill so many.
Yes, but what about the boys from Windermere? Did they keep their faith?
Well, some did and some didn't.
Okay.
Yes, some did and some didn't.
There you go.
Okay. It's a short answer.
Hi, Angela.
Right. Philip Brown wishes to be unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay, hi there, Tracy. I must say, it's an enlightening story of your father. You told it so well tonight, and you created wonderful pictures, not just on the screen, but through your narrative. And I must say, your father is one of the most incredible men. He's not just a role model for your family, but also a role model for the entire Jewish nation. And all the things is something that resonated with me, what he said: if you live with hate, you only hurt yourself. He's a remarkable man, and you should cherish him for maybe another 100 years he might have left. And thank you very much for sharing your story tonight.
Thank you. It means a lot. Thank you.
Right. And can we now look to the future? What are the priorities for the 45 Society? How are you going to keep it going? And will you continue going into the schools? And what will happen when we get to the third generation who have no contact with the survivors of the Holocaust?
Well, I think, but first of all, we will still keep going and talking. And as for third generation, one of my sons has already been with me to share a talk, and there are older third generations who are still giving talks. So hopefully this will carry on for many years. As for the direction of the 45 Aid, I mean, Angela Cohen, our chairperson, is online. She can maybe answer that more better than I can. But for me, it's about the reunions. It's about that, just the connection with our families. And that's really what it's about. And to carry on with educating people about what our parents went through. So Angela, I don't know if you've got anything more to say about the 45 Aid. Would you like to, can you unmute?
Hi, Harry. Hi, Tracy. First of all, I've got to say, seeing the two of you there and listening has been remarkable and utter joy. I've seen it so many times, heard so many stories, but tonight was so incredibly special. And can I thank Edgware for letting me in to listen. The 45 Aid, I think that the second gen that are now running the society and talking, feel an incredible responsibility that we have got to carry on the boys' story. You know, the number of times Harry, Ben have said, you've got to carry on, you've got to carry on, we have to. And I think that is exactly what we're doing. Please God, this year we're going to have a reunion where there will be 700 people. We're going to have a big reunion for the second and third generation in Windermere this year. We are telling stories. We are intergenerational. So when we tell our stories, we tell them they are our parents' stories. They are our stories. When Tracy tells Harry's stories, you feel it. And that's what we have to do. We're not just doing it now to schools. We're doing it to universities. We're doing it to organisation, to football clubs. I mean, especially this year for Holocaust Memorial Day. We will carry on because we feel this sense of responsibility. And people like Harry have made it that we will carry on, and he wants us to carry on. And I know my dad would have done exactly the same. And also, you know, perhaps one of now the most famous third gen is Rob, my son, Rob Rinder. And tomorrow night there's another programme on that you've probably seen. Again, you know, Rob Rinder, the Holocaust and my family. He's perhaps the one that everybody knows, but, you know, we're all telling the story, and his story, 7 million people watched. So we're doing okay.
Yes,
Thank
you're
you.
doing a good job.
Yeah. But as I always said to Dad, you know, I don't love public talking at all, but it was always
You're
my promise.
amazing, Trace.
Thank you, Angela. But it was always my promise to Dad that his story wouldn't end with him. And I think that's a responsibility that so many of us second and third generation feel, to carry on their legacy and their stories.
Exactly right.
Right.
Thank you.
Does anyone want to make a final point before we close? No. In that case, I'd like to thank Tracy Moses and her father, Harry Spiro, for their inspirational talk this evening, and for reminding us that we must always be on our guard against those who wish to discriminate against us, or indeed any other minority group. The message should be that we fight intolerance, ignorance, prejudice, and racial hatred, which made the events of the Holocaust possible. Our next session will be on Tuesday, the 1st of February, when cantorial expert David Prager and director Alex Klein, both of the European Cantors Association, will play UK choral cantorial gems, including choirs in Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester in our monthly cantorial series. I'd like to thank Jeremy Cohen for acting as the facilitator tonight. Details of the HOS sessions are placed on our website, www.edgwareu.com, or alternatively, you can contact our office@edgwareu.com, and ask to be placed on the circulation list for the adult education program. Recorded past sessions are on our Edgware US YouTube channel, and this session will be uploaded immediately to YouTube. Thank you for attending tonight.